Folks, our guest today is Bryan Caplan, professor of economics at George Mason University and a New York Times best-selling author. He's written The Myth of the Rational Voter, named by Nicholas Kristof the best political book of the year in the New York Times in 2007. Also wrote Selfish Reasons to Have More Kids, which our very own Peep Smash swears by as a new parent. The Case Against Education, which of course Granddad Christmas is a big fan of. And Open Borders, the Science and Ethics of Immigration. Co-authored with Saturday Morning Breakfast Cereal's Zach Weinersmith. His latest project, Poverty, Who to Blame, a new book is well underway, so that's pretty exciting. He blogs for EconLog, and his entries have more than a few thoughts on just about every interesting subject under the sun. So, folks, we were talking to Bryan Caplan. Thanks again for joining us. And the first thing I figure we'll talk about is Open Borders. So I gotta say, I really enjoyed your book. I got a chance to read it this past weekend. And some things kind of stood out to me after reading it. First of all, the economics of refugees really stood out to me. You made a really strong case that immigrants with a willing employer and a willing landlord are net economic positives for us in just about every case. But I wonder if the story is the same for refugees. And the reason I'm curious about this is, in the wake of refugees from Syria and Iraq, Turkey had to be paid by the European countries to hold on to these refugees. And now they won't even accept payment anymore. Greece, apparently straining under the burden of these folks, is taking extreme measures to keep them out, even towing refugees to its maritime border with Turkey and abandoning them in unpowered rubber boats. So are these countries fundamentally different from the U.S.? Do these refugees just not offer the same benefits as the immigrants you describe in your book? Or are these countries just passing up a free lunch?
Well, a little bit of both. The main thing about refugees is if you have a policy that makes refugees unproductive, they will be unproductive. So, for example, some countries have laws saying that refugees are not allowed to work. Now, if it is illegal for refugees to work, you should not be surprised if they have very low employment rates and don't contribute very much to society. So that's just the kind of place to start. Then again, of course, if your country says that refugees receive benefits indefinitely, then you should not be surprised to see that they are a overall fiscal drain. On the other hand, if the benefits are shorter duration, or if you just say you can come here but you are not going to be supported, then the numbers are going to look very different. So what I say is this is a case like many others where people act as if it is a fact of nature that someone is or is not a burden on the welfare state, when the real story is that the welfare state itself decides to a large degree who is and is not a burden. And people are just so stubborn about this, so they would rather drag someone off to the maritime border of Turkey than say, fine, we're going to limit the number of months you're able to collect benefits. Because the second thing, that's only a very evil, mean person would do that. Whereas dragging somebody off, well, that's just life.
Well, that's what I'm curious about. How do you think that's an issue of just people trying to hide poverty and cruelty by basically towing people out into the sea and abandoning them as they did in Greece? Or is there something else to it?
Well, that's a lot of it, but I think at the root of it is what we can call the name the puppy phenomenon. So once you give a stray puppy a name, then you don't want to take the puppy to the pound. And then you feel like we've got to go and treat this dog just like any other family dog. Right? And similarly with government services, there is a very ingrained norm that either you are a citizen, in which case you're entitled to 100% of normal stuff, or you're not a citizen, in which case we don't know you diddly squat. Right? And people are very uncomfortable, though, with the idea that someone can be around them for very long and yet remain in that second category of people who aren't entitled to stuff. So I think a lot of it is, like on the surface, it's that we don't want to have to look at bad situations. But on a deeper level, it's, well, if I look at it long enough, then I start to feel like it's my problem, and I don't want to feel like it's my problem, so I don't want to look at it. And if I just do something terrible to you before I actually know you, in order to prevent myself from feeling bad about it, I'm going to do that.
That is tragic. Because I can completely understand the phenomenon, and yet, that's one of those things that it seems, it seems like it'd be very hard to get people to acknowledge, Yeah,
there's something very narcissistic about it, where I'm such a caring person that I can't stand to look at someone who's suffering, and therefore I will increase your suffering a lot so I don't have to look at you. Right? And when you think about it that way, it's like it's not really about the suffering, it's about you. Right? And what kind of a humanitarian does horrible things to people so they don't have to feel bad about themselves?
Well, one of the there are a couple of things I'm curious about in terms of this kind of problem. Especially the notion of people being uncomfortable with, I guess, what you might call a sort of second-class citizenship, where there are benefits that exist to citizenship, and not everybody's entitled to them. So, for example, I know you praise the Gulf states for their immigration, like Qatar, for example, whose temporary worker programs offer no paths to citizenship. But you've said, nevertheless, quote, they are more open to immigration than anywhere else on Earth. I know with respect to the two-tiered society that massive immigration of the Gulf states has created, where large swaths of immigrants live in often miserable conditions without political rights, you've said that such violations are obviously bad, but they're far less overall than outright exclusion, right?
Oh, yeah. Yeah, so you're going to say that that low-skilled workers in Qatar are living in terrible conditions. They're terrible by our standards, but compared to where they are, or the countries that they're coming from, it's great. So again, like the idea that workers from Pakistan go to the Gulf monarchies not knowing what the rough deal is just crazy these days. They've got a bunch of friends and relatives there. They could talk to them on the phone. They can find out. And again, normally the message they're getting is things are great here, like, compared to what we're used to. Yes, are they perfect? No. Do people treat us poorly sometimes? But again, of course, do you think everyone gets treated well in Pakistan? Not in your life.
Well, I'm curious about the effect of this sort of disparity on our domestic politics, because the argument you make right there is very compelling. But, for example, earlier this year, I know its annual Human Development Report, the United Nations said that rising inequality is eroding trust in democratic societies and paving the way for authoritarian and nativist regimes to take root. I know we've seen some of this in Eastern Europe, arguably, and I know some people believe very strongly that there's a current of that in the United States here. The immigrants that we imagine would come to the United States would certainly be poorer, and I know you've made the argument that Alex Nowrasteh from the Cato Institute has made, where you could build a wall around the welfare state, or you could make it harder to aspire to citizenship. But wouldn't exacerbating disparities between people in our country through a regime of open borders immigration encourage more of this kind of inequality that threatens democracy as we know it, even if everybody did benefit financially in the process?
Yeah, I mean, I think all this talk about democracy being threatened in first world countries is pretty crazy. So again, like you may say there's like some marginal changes, but people are just so inclined to hyperbole to go and take any small change in the direction they don't like as the sky is falling, and I just don't see any actual sign of that. In terms of exacerbating inequality, well, so like as I say in the book, there's two kinds of inequality. There's human inequality, and there's inequality within a country. Right, morally speaking, it seems like it would be human inequality that would matter, so that when you take people from poor countries and let them have a better life, that inequality on the human level is actually goes down. On the other hand, if you're only worried about inequality within a country, then sure, if you let in some low-skilled workers, inequality in your country is higher. But again, as to why this is such a problem, if we're really true that letting in guest workers made democracy go down the tubes, then I could understand what people are worried about. I just don't see there's much sign of that. And of course, it's worth pointing out that the countries in Europe where people are most worried about democracy falling are the ones that let in virtually no immigrants. So Hungary, most obviously, Poland. So again, of course, you could say, well, there's many different reasons why trust could decline. My own view here is that one of the big problems in the world is actually an excessive, overzealous kind of national identity where people are really convinced that they're all part of one common family. And what I've said about that generally is that you can't have a free society if everyone feels like they're a family, because within the family, people care too much to allow freedom. If your parents could decide whether you're allowed to be a mountain climber, whether you're allowed to get drunk, whether you're allowed to date a girl they don't like, well, your parents are very likely to say, no, I don't allow this. I love you too much to see you making mistakes. Right? And within a family, of course, at least you can say, well, it's too bad I'm an adult. This is a free society. But if the whole society thinks of itself as a family, then it is a very oppressive and dangerous situation. I said, for a free society, you need to tone down this exaggerated sense that we're all part of a common family and instead focus on respect for other people as free individuals. So the kind of attitude you have towards a neighbor, where you say, hi, how are you doing? Right? Good to see you. Hope things are going well. But you don't go staring in your neighbor's windows to see what they're doing all day. So whereas if your son lived right down the street, who knows what you really might be poking in the window saying, what's going on with my son? How's my son feeling? How's his marriage going? How's he raising his kids? How does he spend his time? He's my son. I'm concerned. Yeah, I love him. I say, yeah, there is this dark side of love, which is it makes it hard for people to respect other people's rights. And you see this as actually one of the major problems of the political world is like these these inappropriate feelings of like because I care about you, therefore I own you, and I'm going to watch you and I'm going to boss you around.
I gotta say, I'm I don't know if it was clear since I'm trying to ask some skeptical questions here. I'm already sold on the basics of the open borders argument, but I have never heard that kind of argument about don't love your neighbor too much, because that's antithetical to freedom. I mean,
yeah. I mean, of course, you can imagine someone who's super loving and yet also super respectful, but it's hard to actually find such people. Where do you find parents who just say, who really would say, like, I totally disagree with what you're doing, but I completely endorse your right to do it? That's not a very parental thing to say.
That's true.
Parental thing to say is, listen, Buster, I do know better.
Is this what you mean when you say that too much solidarity is not a good thing?
Yeah, exactly. Okay. So, if you look at the most oppressive societies in the world today or throughout history, they're great on solidarity. North Korea, like, everyone feels very North Korean in North Korea. Right? And I think it's because the whole system is designed from birth to tell everyone you're part of a group. We all think the same way. We all do the same stuff. We all believe the same thing. We worship the leader. Right? And that's a very dangerous idea. Which, again, is one where I'd just say it is oppressive of the human personality. It's it's one where it's disrespectful of human freedom. And yeah, so again, some solidarity is great, but it's easy to take it too far. And especially when you start feeling strong solidarity with people you've never met, this is one where it does start to become to my mind, it's very destructive of human independence and just the ability to think of yourself as someone who thinks for himself and makes his own choices and plans his own course in life.
Well, toward that end, there's another trend that I'm curious about how you think it'll impact immigration. I know, according to the U.S. Census Bureau, America is set to become a majority-minority nation. That is to say, non-Hispanic whites will be the minority sometime in the 2040s. And in 2014, Maureen Craig and Jennifer Richardson of Northwestern University released a paper called More Diverse Yet Less Tolerant: How the Increasingly Diverse Racial Landscape Affects White Americans' Racial Attitudes, where they found, in essence, that whites exposed to the racial demographic shift information preferred interactions with their own ethnic group over minority ethnic groups and expressed more automatic pro-white anti-minority bias. In light of this kind of research, what do you think about the work of social scientists like, say, University of London professor Eric Kaufman, who claim that the rise of Donald Trump in the United States and the populist right in Europe is a reaction to this sweeping demographic change rather than to economic anxiety? Do you think this kind of backlash at the prospect of changing demographics basically dooms us with respect to immigration reform?
Right. So the doom is just the kind of word I very rarely use because, again, it's hyperbole. You just have to be careful. Like, is it really doom? Like, so what does it mean for there to be doom? That's a 100% chance of the bad thing happening. But in terms of, like, is it plausible that this is making this more likely, or that this making the problem more likely? So the original research where you just change the framing in an experiment and then you get a different reaction. So that's the kind of research that is very clearly accurate as far as it goes, but as to what it means in the real world is quite unclear. So if in an experiment you randomly told about changing demographics or not, but the experiment only lasts an hour, what is it really like? So, like, is this actually going to generalize to real life? Very unclear that it would. In terms of the evidence, which is not nearly as ironclad, it's not real experiments, but it's drawn from the real world. So what we can say is that in the U.S., it is the states that have the highest share of foreigners that are most pro-immigration, which could be reverse causation. It could be immigrants go to the states where people like them. However, if you actually look at the map, it pretty much just looks like people go to the states that are either on the border or where it's basically where you land, like New York City, or places where there's a lot of immigrants already. So in that case, it doesn't look like people are deliberately going to places where they like immigrants. They're going to places that are convenient. And then we see that the population of those places is more pro-immigrant. And in particular, I have a blog post where I show that if you assume that all immigrants are pro-immigrant, which is not true, by the way, but if you just assume that, even so, the remaining native population is more pro-immigrant in places where there's higher immigration. So I would say that very much looks like exposure leads to greater tolerance, not less. In the case of Brexit and the UK, the two big facts are, first of all, the higher the foreign-born share of the area, the lower the Brexit vote. But then second of all, the greater the change in foreign-born share, the lower the Brexit vote. Now, many people have looked at this and said, see, we're right about the immigrants eroding social trust or something like that. At minimum, I'd say, well, hold on. Like, by one measure, you're right. By one measure, you're wrong. So don't be claiming victory then. Crazy. But I mean, actually, but I'd say, but, even, on a deeper level, say, well, wait. So what does it take to make the places that have had a large increase in immigration look like places that have a lot of immigrants? It just seems like you just need more immigrants and plus some passage of time. So, I would say is it's not so much backlash as some temporary pushback, which seems to dissolve once you've had a lot of immigrants for a reasonable amount of time.
Okay. Well, I mean, that definitely makes sense. But what I'm, another thing I'm curious about here is something you said in the book, responding to Milton Friedman's claim that you, quote, cannot simultaneously have free immigration and a welfare state, by saying he was wrong. You say that free immigration with a U.S.-style welfare state is not a recipe for fiscal disaster, which is certainly good for somebody who wants to open borders, because it seems like undoing the welfare state would be a tall order in the United States. But would your argument fall apart, and would Milton Friedman be proven right if we had, for example, the kind of universal compulsory health insurance plans they have in some European and East Asian countries, or some kind of negative income taxation? Like, how far does that U.S.-style specificity go?
Right. So I don't remember any papers that do a really good multinational comparison for immigrants. I do know that there have been some papers that have done this for native-born babies. Right. So in other words, when a new baby is born, is that baby expected to be a net burden on society or not? And the main answer to the paper is basically a new baby is a fiscal burden in the Gulf monarchies. Because in the Gulf monarchies, every baby born is entitled to a big share of oil revenue for their whole life. And so when you basically have this fixed pool of oil and every baby gets his cut, then every baby is basically sucking up some of the resources that would be being paid by the government to other Saudis. But once you get outside of the Gulf monarchies, my memory is that even bigger welfare states, like you'll see in some European countries, still the birth of a new baby appears to be a net positive, I think in almost all of them anyway. Then immigrants actually normally look better than natives because as long as they come as an adult, then you get to skip paying out on their education and that kind of thing. Now, so on the other hand, they may, if you're talking about low-skilled immigrants, then they'll probably have lower income than the average native. But on the other hand, just getting to skip out on education costs for an immigrant is an enormous cost saving. So I would say the honest answer is I know the data really well for the U.S., and I haven't seen really good data for other countries. What I say is that the numbers look good enough for the U.S. that you have to move pretty far from the U.S. before an immigrant starts to become a net burden. But I mean, even then, so even if an immigrant is a modest net fiscal burden, that's only one factor out of many to keep in mind. So say that as well.
Okay. So then, but as far as you know, when it comes to these European countries, we don't know where they, where we look and think about potential future welfare state programs. The calculus doesn't look too much different. Yeah.
I mean, so here's the thing is, for example, in Scandinavia, they do have much more generous benefits, but they also have higher taxes. And their taxes actually, in some ways, they're less progressive than ours because they have a lot of VATs, basically like high national sales taxes. So when the U.S. tax system is actually quite progressive. So it does tend to put low-skilled immigrants into a negative light because of that. I think probably overall the Swedish tax system probably is still more progressive, but the difference is just not nearly as big as you might think, because again, the world's complicated and there's multiple different sources of government revenue. And even though it's true that the top marginal rates would be higher in Scandinavia, but they also have these high national sales taxes that would be getting paid by anyone who buys anything legally.
Do you, I know you describe in the book immigration restrictions not just as restrictions, but as a kind of global apartheid. Not something, stopping short of calling them slavery, but nevertheless calling them something, very pernicious. Do you think that that an immigrant who crosses, say the border of the United States to come to the country is not just responding to incentives, but morally justified opposing or circumventing such a system?
Yeah, that's a great question. So I'd like to step back and just think about, when is it okay to break the law? All right, well, let's see. There's a few different answers you could give. One is, it's never okay to break the law. All right, fortunately, Nazi Germany has forever ended that position as being anything anyone wants to defend seriously. Like, what if the government starts rounding up people and killing them? Then you should follow that law? No.
Right.
All right, so virtually like any sober person will say, fine, when the law is that bad, then it's okay to break it. All right, but then if you start and you say, how about at the other end? How about if a law is just kind of stupid? If the law is just kind of stupid, is it okay to break it then? And actually, just from observing what people do, I would say that most people believe that. So my dad, who's probably the angriest critic of immigration that I know, if he, he has really got an added extra living space to his attic without any permission, deliberately didn't get the permits, and he feels totally justified in that. And it's like, well, so you're breaking the law so that you can go and add a little storage space in your attic. All right, there's that. And then, of course, almost everybody speeds. All right, and then it's like, so now there's a law where actually it's pretty easy to understand why there is a law against speeding, right? You're worried about the danger not only to yourself but to others. And yet almost everyone thinks it's okay to go 5 or 10 miles per hour over the speed limit when there's not a lot of cars around. All right, so once you've got all of those in your mind, you realize, okay, so sometimes it's perfectly okay to break the law. And in fact, most people, probably including whoever's listening, breaks the law routinely. There's a very good book called, I believe, 3 Felonies a Day, just going over all the laws that you're probably breaking without even knowing it. And again, probably you're not going to change your behavior just because you found out that it's illegal. You are going instead to you're going to keep doing it, I would think. So anyway, so when you think about all these cases, then the question of, all right, suppose that you're in Mexico, you're having trouble supporting your family, and you find that if you were to go and illegally cross the border into the U.S., you can make 5 times as much money and everyone in your family will eat well. Does that seem like a reasonable case of breaking a law? And I'd say, to me, it's hard to find any clear-cut case of a justified case of law breaking. It was like, I'm not going to steal anyone or hurt anyone. I'm just going to go to work on a farm. I'm going to go and do the same job that I'm currently doing in another country. I'm going to make more money for myself. I'll contribute more to the world, and I'm going to help my family. What's wrong with that? And again, to say that that's wrong, but speeding's okay, I just don't understand where someone would be coming from to say that.
Yeah, it's an interesting question because, when you use that terminology, I was thinking, well, that's a system that people opposed with every means possible. And yet one of the most common things we hear from opponents of immigration is, look, I like immigrants, I like immigration, but you got to come here legally. Okay, you've committed a crime, we got to enforce the law. And that argument seems so, when it comes to an issue like this, that seems so, all of the problems with it seem to be in the politics, in the questions I asked, basically. How do people feel about it? How will people respond politically to it? It's hard to imagine the justification to say, no, you must follow the law, because otherwise, worse outcomes will result.
Right. And how many people have ever heard of a cop who let their friend off with a warning, who then said that cop was terrible? You've got to enforce the law. I mean, obviously, if the cop lets you off, that's always justified, right?
Right.
Yeah, you let me off with a warning, and I can't believe I even had to ask. You should have done it without me even having to plead.
Yeah. Each of us has has our special reason, right? Why our case is different.
Right. So one other case. So think about the fairly well-established custom of flashing your high beams to warn people about a speed trap on the other side. This is not a case where you think that where it's just your own selfishness saying, I don't want the law enforced on me. This is one where you clearly think that the people on the other side are going to be mistreated by the police, and you're trying to stop that from happening by warning them. So if you're willing to do that, and if you think that's okay or that's even good, if you've ever done that yourself, again, why you would think that it's terrible for someone to cross the border illegally to get a job, I do not know.
Have you ever run into any really thoughtful, I guess, critics of open immigration? Who are the most, I guess, thoughtful critics you've talked to or heard from or who've written on this subject?
Yeah. So in my book, I go over basically three different lines of argument in this chapter on political effects of immigration. So, and again, like anything where we talk about, well, maybe immigrants will mess up the politics of the country. Mm-hmm. That's where I take it the most seriously because, of course, the reason why immigrants are coming is generally because your country has a better political system, and especially has had a better political system for a long period of time, which fosters a high standard of living and a peaceful and comfortable way of life. All right. So anyway, so anyone who like has an argument saying like, immigrants are going to kill the goose that lays the golden eggs, that's where I take it most seriously. And so in my book, I go over three different main categories of arguments like this. So one just says, look, immigrants come from messed up countries. People in messed up countries usually have messed up political views, and when they come to our country, they're going to turn our country into their country. So that's one where I actually just go and look at the numbers and to see, well, what is it that foreign-born people in the U.S. think compared to native-born? But, like the quick version is their views just aren't that different. So while the argument sounds plausible, it doesn't really check out very well. I give more details in the book because it's a little more complicated. Mm-hmm. Then there's this body of research saying that the countries that are most successful today are the ones that are inhabited by people whose ancestors were relatively successful many centuries ago. So, I mean, when you think about countries that have gone from being very poor countries in the broad scheme of things to being very rich countries, normally the reason is just that the people in that country totally replaced the people originally there. So, for example, you have the Americas where you have mostly quite backwards civilizations that are here before. So even the Incas and the Aztecs don't have the wheel, for example. All right, and then what happens is that these areas, especially U.S. and Canada, become some of the richest areas of the world. But it wasn't by building modern civilization where American Indians are the main population. Instead, you just mostly replaced, often through horrible means, the American Indian population with Europeans whose ancestors were much more advanced 500 years ago. So anyway, there's been quite a bit of academic research on this. And again, this could be a totally cultural argument, but it would seem that if that's true, then culture is just very long-lasting. So anyway, what I do in the book is I go over the research in a lot more detail, and I just say that there's a bunch of problems with it. So like one of the main ones being that the three largest countries in the world seem to have that the model predicts very poorly how they're doing. So China and the United States are the three largest populations in the world. China and India have a fantastic historical level of advancement. They're some of the oldest, most ancient civilizations in the world, and yet, like both China and India are still quite poor. So China's improved a bit, but still, at best, mediocre for the world by world standards. India's still very poor. So these are two large countries where the model predicts poorly. United States also. So Europeans are latecomers to the game of civilization. So again, by this model, it seems like we shouldn't be doing that well, and yet we're doing great. So anyway, as I say, this is not just saying there's three counterexamples. I'm saying the three largest countries in the world by far, the model doesn't work for them at all. And when you go and redo the math where you say, well, let's count countries by their population, then this whole story no longer works very well. So there's more to it than that. And the last one, the one that I take most intellectually seriously, is the concern that in poor countries, they usually have very low IQ. Mm-hmm. And the story is that this low IQ, it means something. It means that intelligence levels are generally, though not always, low in poor countries, which in turn leads these countries to be dysfunctional. Right now, this is an argument that I was encouraged by my editor just to drop. But I said, look, this is actually an intellectually compelling argument. I think it's wrong, but it's one where all the pieces seem to make sense at first, and where if we're going to address the intellectually highest quality arguments against my view, we really do need to turn directly to it. And so I spend quite a bit of time, first of all, presenting that argument, which I know a lot of people find deeply offensive and distressing. But I said, look, that's not a reason to say an argument's wrong, right? So, like if you find out from a doctor you're going to die of cancer in 6 months, oh, that's wrong. It's distressing. Like, that doesn't show it's wrong.
Well, let
shows, yes, of course, it's damn distressing.
Let me ask you about IQ, actually, because that's something I'm curious about. You called yourself an IQ realist and said that on your blog that IQs are an excellent proxy for what ordinary language calls intelligence, and so you've done a lot of writing on it. At the same time, one line in particular stands out to me, and I think the reason I wanted to ask you about this is that I think this is maybe why your editor suggested to drop it. You said, "My fellow IQ realists are, on average, a scary bunch." So what do you mean by that?
Yeah, so he said, I think that IQ tests are not perfect, but they're very good, about as good as human beings should be able to get at measuring this ordinary language trait that we call intelligence. But I've also met people who share this view, and a lot of them are scary people. So, I mean, definitely if you go and talk to anyone who spontaneously brings up IQ in Africa, there is about a 50% chance that they're talking about genocide within a couple of minutes. And I've met them, and it's just like, holy moly, like, what are you, a supervillain? Saying, these people, their intelligence is lower. They must be wiped off the face of the earth. And like, no, it's not okay to murder people for not being Einstein. Yeah. It's terrible. So, I, of course, I've had other people say, well, I'm an IQ realist, and I've never met these people. I'm like, that's odd. Yeah. Seems like I've seen some of them commenting on your blog. They're around. You don't have to look that hard for them. Now, I mean, sometimes people will say, like at the very highest level of research, then I don't find the genocidal people. I'm like, well, I'm also talking about the people who consume this research. Yeah, so there is something about people who are predisposed to horrible evil. When they hear someone saying that some group's more intelligent than other people, saying, aha, I always knew they should be murdered. It's like, what are you talking about? That doesn't show that at all. This is you say something like that. Right. It's crazy.
Yeah, and I'm glad you bring that up, because this gets to especially to tie up the immigration issue. You mentioned that basically the most effective way to help people with IQs is for them to grow up in countries like Sweden, right? And it seems like what you're making there is an argument that IQ is primarily environmental.
So it's complicated. So here's the thing. So I actually have a whole other book on human genetics and why people turn out the way that they do. So when you look within rich countries, this is where it seems like genes are much more important than people want to admit. So there's a lot of research on what happens if you get adopted within a rich country. So you get adopted from a poor family to from a poor family to a rich family. How much better do you wind up doing in life? And the answer is actually probably only a little bit better. So you probably get a little bit more school, might not even make any more money. So it's a small difference. But then the question is, all right, so if moving you from a poor family in the U.S. to a rich family in the U.S. doesn't make much difference, what about moving you from Chad to Sweden? And so what I do I actually did this in some blog posts, and then I wound up talking about it in Open Borders, is I say, all right, so let's go and take a look at the adult outcomes of people that are internationally adopted into Sweden from when they are infants. Or like really in the data would be like either 0 to 3 months or 0 to 6 months. And how do those adoptees compare to adults that spend their whole lives in Chad or whatever it is? And so what I'm able to show there is that even on very conservative assumptions, moving someone from a poor third world country to when they are very young, to let them grow up in a rich first world country, increases their IQ a lot. It doesn't seem like it's enough to close the whole gap. And again, there's different possibilities about why it doesn't close the whole gap. But still, in terms of what are the most effective ways to make a person get much higher scores in an IQ test in adulthood, the answer is moving them from being in a poor country when they're a baby to being in a rich country when they're a baby is as far as I can tell, it is the most effective treatment that anyone has ever found. So again, that doesn't show that it's all environmental, but basically what I'd say is that it shows moving someone from an extremely deprived environment to a normal environment is a big help. Moving someone within a first world country where either way you're getting enough food, you're going to school, you're getting clothes and so on, then maybe that doesn't make so much difference. But moving someone from a very poor country to a rich one does make a big difference. So if you really care about IQ, you should want immigration so that more babies can grow up in rich countries.
Yeah, that's what I thought was really interesting about that line of thinking, is because for the reasons you basically expounded on, normally when people start talking about IQ, I think, oh, okay, all right, let's move on. But when you described that phenomenon, it sounded, I don't know, it sounded like there was a lot of environmental improvement
Yeah.
for people to consider. So you don't have to throw the whole idea out.
Yeah, I mean, of course, this is not just IQ that you can improve by international adoption. So there's even more bulletproof research on height, for example. If you grow up in a poor country, you're very likely to be short. Grow up in Sweden, you're going to be a lot taller, right? This is not culturally constructed. This is not some plot to go and make anyone feel bad about anything. It's not an attempt to sustain oppression of any kind. It's just what the yardstick or the meter stick says about your height. Right. And again, so if you go and look within people who grew up in Sweden, there's not going to be much difference in height between growing up poor in Sweden and growing up rich in Sweden, because either way you're getting your nutrition, you're getting your sanitation. But on the other hand, growing up poor in Ethiopia versus growing up in Sweden, there's going to be a big difference in nutrition and sanitation and so on, which then translates into a very noticeable difference in height. So if that's bulletproof, then again, you should be very open to the idea that mental skills, psychological traits would also be so shaped by being moved from very poor countries to rich ones. And that's what I say the data actually show. Now, again, this is an issue where, of course, wishful thinking is not okay, right? And often the world doesn't work out the way that you want it to work out. So, I am not the kind of person that would sugarcoat the truth or hide the facts. But on the other hand, when you go through the numbers and you find, look, there's some things that are not what people want to hear. There's other things that they do want to hear. I just try to disclose candidly. And also, a lot of what I try to do in the book, honestly, is to show I'm not sugarcoating things. So sometimes my editor would say, well, this point doesn't really help your thesis. We should cut it. And say, no, we should keep it because what I said is true. Yeah, it isn't helpful for my thesis, but it's true. And that's how I roll. I say things that are not helpful to me, so that in the interest of full disclosure.
Well, I know you're working on a book on poverty now, correct?
And,
I watched, or actually we watched on stream a few months back, your 2019 Hayek Memorial Lecture, where you said, wherever mankind has seen a large overall increase in production, the benefits have always been widely shared. I know of no exceptions. And I believe that you used the popular graph from Our World in Data that shows poverty has just been on a very, gentle at first and then very rapid decline since 1820, basically the beginning of the Industrial Revolution. But there are folks who say that these benefits have really not been widely shared. For example, Dr. Jason Hickel of the University of London charges that graph depicts a poverty line of $1.90 a day and said this is way too low. Under a more realistic metric of about $7.50 a day, the number of people in poverty has increased, and the few gains that have been made have all occurred in one place, China. And if you take China out of the equation, things look even worse. Not only has the number of people gone up, but the proportion of people in poverty has remained stagnant for decades now. So I know you're talking about, don't sugarcoat things, no wishful thinking. Well, is the world really winning the fight against poverty, or is that just, tricks with numbers?
Yeah, I mean, I don't know the work of the researcher that you're talking about. So I know that this works with a bunch of other poverty lines. So, works with, if you move up to, like a $4 poverty line or $5 poverty line. I don't remember $7 specifically. Again, so I have seen, however, what's happened to the overall distribution of global income. So it doesn't seem consistent with a $7 line. And again, you can also do it if you look at median income around the world. That's gone way up. And again, the idea that this only works for China again is bizarre. So they get enormous gains in India, big gains in most of Eastern Europe. So again, it just seems wrong. And of course, if you suddenly had him spring up, then he would probably be able to defend himself ably, because I haven't read his work and I haven't gone through it. But again, it seems so out of whack with everything else that I've seen. I do think that either he's wrong, or there's something very misleading, or perhaps he has found one of the very few measures by which he's right. But again, if you say there's 100 measures by which poverty has gone down, and I found the one where it doesn't, that doesn't show that one measure is the good measure.
Well, the reason I ask is this is something I hear a lot when we talk to especially lefties and socialists, is that your business about the world improving is based on skewed data. Almost all the improvements are in China, and elsewhere things are pretty much stagnant. And it sounds like you're saying that's just not true.
Yeah. So, of course, there are enormous gains in China. I mean, that would be the country where, in a way, I'd be most skeptical about the numbers being inflated, because it's a communist dictatorship and they've got very bad records for being truthful in general. And then I know there's a lot of other problems with Chinese data. I don't have any doubt that things have improved tremendously there. But again, the idea things haven't improved a lot in India seems quite crazy.
Let me ask you, another question about poverty. During the lecture, you borrowed an interesting trifecta of life advice from Ron Haskins and Isabel Sawhill of the Brookings Institution in a 2009 book they published called Creating an Opportunity Society. And you said that in rich countries, there's been some interesting research that basically able-bodied adults can avoid poverty quite easily. Just work full-time, even if the best job you can get isn't fun. Spend your money on food and shelter before cigarettes and cable TV, and use contraception if you can't afford a child. And if you do these things, the poverty rate is just 2%. If you do none of these things, your poverty rate is around 75%. But, don't you think factoids like these oversimplify the issue and undermine some of your other arguments? For example, housing regulations, a major poverty driver. Poorly designed welfare programs can trap people in poverty. I mean, does America really need another excuse for why people should just fend for themselves?
Right. Well, so I would say that the exact way that you stated the 3 steps, I think those might be my words rather than theirs. Theirs are very similar, but so actually their steps are a little bit different. So their steps are, first of all, finish high school. Second of all, work full time, and then third, delay having children until you're married. Okay, that's almost the same as you said, although not quite. But anyway, yeah. So the evidence there is very good that if you follow those 3 steps, then your odds of being in poverty are very low, and if you follow none of those 3 steps, your odds of being in poverty are very high. What I would say is, at minimum, a bunch of other things can be true, but if that's true, that's also worth saying. So, if you saw someone who was living in poverty and they said, well, what am I to do? There's a lot of housing regulation, and that's really important. And I said, okay, yes, it's true that there is a lot of housing regulation, and it is bad, and it is causing a lot of problems. But that doesn't mean that you can't fix your problem, even in the existing world right now, not fix it as well as you could in a world where things were better. But still, in terms of if you had a kid saying, whatever am I to do? Well, yeah, whatever you are to do is follow those steps that I just described, and that is a very good way of avoiding serious problems. In terms of whether you should be saying these things in a society where there's already a bunch of bad policies, so I would say, look, if it's true and helpful, then I don't know why you shouldn't say it.
Do you think
it really comes from different angles? So when you're talking about how can we go and make it easier for people to get themselves out of poverty, then sure, talk about how we need to deregulate housing. But you're talking about what can an individual who in this society do in order to avoid poverty? Then I think it makes sense. Well, what the individual can do, the individual, they can't deregulate housing by themselves. It's like, boom, I'm going to deregulate. Hey, you don't like being homeless? Well, why don't you deregulate housing? I can't do that. Yeah. It's not, no, but it is within your power, however, to do those other things. And again, so what's notable about those things is it's not like saying, well, you don't want to be in poverty, well, then found the next Google. Which is also something that would work if you could do it, but it's just not. But it's a very stupid piece of advice, because you're telling people, hey, you're failing, do something almost no one can do, and then you'll do great. It's like, well, thanks a lot. Cure cancer, then you won't be poor. Yeah, I know that. If I cured cancer, I wouldn't be poor anymore, but I wouldn't have the slightest idea of how to even start doing that. So that's not helpful. On the other hand, just saying things like, don't have unprotected sex until you're ready to have a child. This is not rocket science. You don't need to be really smart to do it. You don't need to be really wise to do it. It isn't something where you need to go to school to hear about it. And indeed, in all of the reading that I've done about poverty, what's really striking to me is that usually single parent, young single parents, teen single parents, or teen parents in their 20s, people will say, well, they're in a subculture that encourages them to do this. It's like, that's not really true. I mean, normally their parents are telling them, don't do what I did. Their friends who already had kids are telling them, man, I really messed up. Teachers are telling them not to do it. So again, it's one where it's not something where you have to go and change your whole culture in order to discover anyone who thinks that you're doing something that is unwise. it's actually all around you. So, I would say that it is both reasonable to say that it's good advice, and also to say, look, you really should have done it. And it is not fair to a total stranger just to put the blame on them when you had very straightforward ways of solving your own problem. And in particular, just like one example, like there was long a theory that that poor teenagers have less knowledge of contraception, and that's the problem. But then researchers came along and said, no, poor teens have better knowledge of contraception than middle class teens. Well, middle class teens, since having sex is not on their agenda at all, they actually have quite poor knowledge of contraception, whereas poor teens are more likely to actually either be doing it or know people are doing it. It's just a question of actually using it versus not. And so the usual pattern is not that is not that the poor teens or poor people in their 20s don't use contraception, but they stop using it after a couple of months of relationship. On what would see, it's like, I didn't want them to feel like that I didn't really love them, and it's like, well, it doesn't seem like a good reason when you're totally unprepared for dealing with a situation. And right, it doesn't seem like you need to be 50 years old to know that.
Do you think? I guess even when you mention high school, for example, graduate high school, it makes me think about all the disparities in education in the United States, which I'm sure you're well versed in. Of course, I haven't written a book about it. Some school districts are far and away better than others, are they not? Is it always? I guess I'm asking: is that always and everywhere a fair thing to say to people, or is that itself kind of situationally dependent?
Right. So if you thought the main thing going on in high school is that you're learning useful skills, then this would be a very fair point, saying, well, look, kids that are going to bad areas don't learn a lot of useful skills. Kids that in good areas do learn a lot of useful skills. So, of course, there's going to be the disparity. My view is actually most of the social reward just comes from getting the stamp on your forehead of finishing. And actually, the truth is that in poor areas, you usually have low standards, so it's easier to finish than it is in a rich area. So in a rich area, you can say, how can that be when dropout rates are much higher in poor areas?
Right.
Well, the honest answer is that standards are low, but performance is even worse. And so you get high dropout rates in bad areas. But if you were to go and switch students from the rich area to the students from the rich area to the poor school and vice versa, you'd see that kids that are from the rich areas would find the classes in poor areas to be ridiculously easy, and they would have a near 100% graduation rate. And on the other hand, the kids in poor schools would probably be doing even worse unless, of course, you shunt them into really easy classes in the rich neighborhoods, which often will happen.
Well, let me, I guess to that effect then, let me ask you some questions about, I guess kind of your overarching philosophy here, economically and I guess politically too. Libertarian anarcho-capitalist, right? And I'm curious, I guess, first of all, I was curious about this today, and I took another look through just the national rankings. And when we look at countries that are generally ranked by everybody who tries to do this kind of stuff as the freest and happiest countries in the world, the countries that always stand out are the Nordic countries. Norway, Sweden, Denmark, Finland, and Iceland. They're all very high in economic freedom, happiness, to the extent you can study such a thing. Some of them are comparable with the U.S. in terms of metrics like ease of doing business. So how can arguments for libertarianism really fundamentally be persuasive in a world where we can look at another model of social democracy among Nordic countries that seem to have, on all the metrics we generally care about, figured things out?
Yeah, so that's a very good question. So, of course, the easy answer is reverse causation. So it's not that the Scandinavian model makes countries rich, but then when countries are rich, they feel they can afford the Scandinavian model. All right, now, of course, that's very intellectually convenient for libertarians. Doesn't mean it's wrong, though, right? And so the usual story is those countries, like until the '60s, had quite free market policies, and then started moving towards much bigger welfare states afterwards. But they were already doing quite well at the time that they moved. Now, as to whether that fully checks out or not. I haven't seen the data, so I'm not confident about that. But again, that does seem like a very reasonable point. And obviously, if you were to go to very poor countries and say, what you can do to do well, just copy Sweden, right? Swedish model is not going to work for Congo.
Sure.
Right. Swedish model will not work for Cambodia. You can't get rich just by going and spending a very large amount of money that your country doesn't even have yet. So that's the first thing that I would say is a lot of what's going on is reverse causation. Countries have to be rich in order to be able to afford this large welfare state. So that's the first thing. All right. Now you could still say, well, at least that large welfare state isn't enough to destroy those countries. And I'll say, yeah, okay, that's true. Yeah, the Swedish welfare state has not destroyed Sweden. I don't see any sign that it's going to destroy Sweden anytime soon. In terms of happiness, what I'd say is when you go and look at happiness, like the United States is really close to those Scandinavian countries. So, a lot of it, I think, honestly, just fits with the story that after a certain point, politics, neither politics nor per capita income have much effect on happiness, which, again, I will say is ideologically inconvenient for almost anyone who cares about their views, because then you have to admit, wow, people would be very similarly happy in a lot of different regimes. Again, I'll just say you just have to be honest, and that's true. So I'm a big fan of the Greek philosopher Epicurus, and I would say that most of what he said about human happiness 2,500 years ago has been confirmed by modern psychology, which is, like if you're hungry, you're going to be unhappy, right? If you're freezing, you're going to be unhappy, but once you have a reasonable level of comfort, then what really matters for happiness is going to be things like, do you have a lot of close friends, is your family doing well? And of course, do you set reasonable expectations for yourself? If you say, I'm going to be miserable, my life is meaningless unless I'm a Nobel Prize winner, you're going to be a miserable person, very likely. I've actually known miserable Nobel Prize winners. I really have. I've met them, and they are glum chums because the other Nobelists don't treat them like an inferior. Right? It is just like, what is wrong with you? You got a Nobel Prize and you're feeling sorry for yourself? Like, well, the other Nobel Prize winners act like I'm a second-class Nobel. Come on, man! But right, so this is within my first-hand experience. So, so that's what I'd say about human happiness in terms of economic freedom. So, there was a big decline under Obama for the U.S., although there was also pretty substantial recovery. Basically, the countries or the measures where the economic freedom of Scandinavia is comparable to the U.S. are all ones where you basically put zero weight on taxes. And I think that you should have a lot of weight on taxes. Right? So obviously, if there's a country where the economy is totally free, but the tax rate was 99%, that wouldn't be much of a free economy. It's like, yeah, you're free to do anything you want, but you only keep 1 penny on the dollar for every dollar you earn.
Yeah.
So, the idea that taxes are relevant for freedom or something like that is, I think, just conceptually very silly. And again, it's one where you can say, well, is your freedom really so bad when the tax rate is 50% versus 40%? It's like, well, it's like 10 percentage points more. And if we just keep pushing it, then eventually almost everyone will say that you've lost almost all your freedom because anything that you earn, you don't get to keep. So, yeah. Now, the other thing that I would say is that it's always a good idea to look at the full data set before you start saying that something doesn't matter. So if you only look at compare like Sweden to the U.S., right, you say, well, they have some important differences, and yet it's not clear which one is doing better overall. So even that I would tend to question. So I've spent quite a bit of time in Sweden, and I would say that but for the language barrier, I think that it's pretty clear that most people in Sweden probably would rather be in the United States. You can just say Swedish standard of living is by American standards is much worse in a lot of ways. That I don't think get very well counted in normal data. But honestly, my favorite test in any country, anytime I visit a country, is okay, let's go to the grocery stores regular people shop in, and just see what life is like in this country. And on the one hand, of course, usually countries that are supposedly rich, their grocery stores look pretty good, but there's some notable disparities. And yeah, Scandinavian grocery stores are quite distressingly bad given their official numbers. Even Norway, which officially is quite a bit richer per capita than the U.S., but if Americans could go to a Norwegian grocery store and just look at it for a while, I think you would just be appalled. It's like, wow, these people don't really seem all that rich at all. Yeah. I mean, if you go in the summer, there's flies. There are flies over the produce. Remember, I was asking the Swedes, why are there flies over the produce here? And they said, oh, this is rot month. You're like, it's what? It's what month? It's the month where the food is rotting. You're like, well, in America, we don't have rotten month. How can you have rotten month? And like, well, like it's a cold country, so it's not really worth refrigerating the stuff. So we just have a lot of flies around during this time of the summer. And I'm just like, wow, there's warm parts of the U.S. and you don't see flies all over the produce there. But anyway, so what I'd say is that if you really want to get to idea, you want to zoom out and look at all the data. And that's where I would say that you really can see the countries with the very least economic freedom are total basket cases. And on average, as you move in the direction of more economic freedom, things really do look better. And again, especially when you think about economic freedom, what matters is not the economic freedom this year, but your history of economic freedom. So there's a lot of countries that have good policies right now and they're growing, but they had really bad policy for a long time, and therefore they are basically reaping the the effects of the accumulated policy over time. So when you look at countries that are really poor, usually I would say it really is because they've had very statist policies. And so I think that libertarians really have very, very little to feel chagrined about when they look at the overall data. But, of course, if you do look at Sweden versus the U.S., if you think of them as being like night and day countries, then you should be very puzzled. If you think of them as being actually not all that different, and Sweden is quite a bit less socialist than people think, and America is quite a bit more. And anyway, a lot of what's going on is that it's once the countries become rich that they feel able to go and have these kinds of policies. Then I think the libertarian view makes a lot more sense.
All right. Well, let me ask you some kind of just some sort of quicker, I guess, questions to kind of close out with. I know we've been talking for almost an hour now, so I've got a few here. I'm going to ask you first of all. Milton Friedman used to describe the land value tax as the least bad tax. What is your favorite tax? If we've got to have taxes, and what taxes do you think are the worst?
Yeah. So see, my favorite taxes are on violent crime and property crime. If you could actually tax that. All right, and then secondly, taxes on taxes on pollution, right? And then as to whether or not you want to call this a tax, I would just say that like having tolls on roads during times when the roads are congested. So I say these are all the best ways to go and raise money because you are solving a problem in the process of raising money. And furthermore, often you're also discouraging something where either is a clear-cut rights violation, or at least where it's just not clear what it is. So in the case of pollution, it's like, well, it would be a rights violation if I put out 1,000 times as much pollution as I currently do, right? If I put out 1,000 times as much particulate as my car does in my neighborhood, that would be enough. That would be like basically like putting out an enormous amount of toxic fumes in my neighborhood. So that would be a rights violation. So what about if I do that at a much lower level? It's like, well, it's kind of a rights violation. Like, like there's a level low enough where you'd say, no, like it's okay to go and roast a marshmallow over an open fire, but it's not okay to have a giant bonfire. And like, where do we draw the line on that? And the answer, well, eventually it would be a rights violation, but it's hard to say. So I'd say, that is actually a much less objectionable tax for libertarians, but also much more economically sound. Say we're going to go and tax things that actually are rights violations, or at least are kind of like rights violations, right? And after going and taxing all things like that, then and only then start thinking about things like taxing land, where the best you can say for an economic theory is it doesn't really do any harm. But again, why not actually kill two birds with one stone? So in technical jargon, this is taxing negative externalities. There's more to it than that, but that's the basic idea.
Okay. What about welfare programs? For example, I know he would advocate a negative income tax as the least bad welfare program. Right. Where do you view those generally, and specifically universal health care, which is the one I think that's on everybody's mind. Some form of it, maybe like they do in Germany or Switzerland, where it's insurance rather than a state-controlled model like in Britain. But so best and worst welfare programs, and then specifically health care. Right.
So in terms of best and worst welfare programs, so any program that everybody gets regardless of behavior, I think is a terrible one. And so if you were a philanthropist, you wouldn't just go and say, I'm going to go and give my money to help everybody. You would try to figure out where will it do the most good, who actually needs the most help, who is unable to help themselves. These are all questions for any philanthropy. And I would say that whenever you're evaluating welfare programs as well, these questions should be foremost on your mind. Are we wasting the money on people who don't need it? Are we going and targeting the money to where it will do the most good? are we targeting the money to people who can't help themselves? So again, I would say that the best programs are ones where you're helping kids from poor families, we're helping, or it's actually refugees best of all. So we started with refugees, and let's bring up refugees again. So like the odds that a refugee is somehow morally to blame for their country going up in flames is very low. These are like helpless victims of broader social forces. They've often lost everything they have. Then they show up in a new country. They don't speak the language. They don't know what to do. And again, to me, that's where you should start first. People like that, where they really don't, you honestly say they don't have the same advantages that someone who grew up in this country and was fortunate enough to do so did. So let's start off by helping them. Programs that target poor kids, I think, are the best. With a negative income tax, this is one where you would still get it even if you didn't have any kids, for example. Right? Or you could be 18 years old. Like in most systems, as soon as you're an adult, then you're eligible for the negative income tax. So I just want to be a surfer, and I'm going to earn no money, and I'm just going to get money from the government. It's like why is that a good system? Now, in terms of universal health care, I would say this is an especially foolish one. First of all, because it's universal, and universal programs are terrible because they waste almost all the money is going to people who don't need the help. So if you were a philanthropist and you spent 90% of your philanthropy on people that didn't need the help, you would say you are a terrible philanthropist. You just wasted almost all your money. Why didn't you go and take all the money and give it to people that really needed it, rather than just throwing it around like a drunken sailor? And the same thing goes for all universal programs. Helping all old people is stupid. Most old people can take care of themselves, especially if they know that is their responsibility, right? Most parents are able to go and provide for their own kids, especially if they know well in advance that it's their own responsibility. Similarly, for universal health care, most people are able to work and provide for their own health care. So why is it a good idea to give it to everybody? Now, this is one where it's especially foolish because there has been a good amount of research on the question, how much do people who receive, say, Medicaid value the Medicaid? Right? And the very strong finding is they valued it way below the cost. Really? Way below the cost. I think the usual estimate is something like they value it somewhere between 20 and 25% of the cost. All right. So this means that in terms of the values of the people that you're helping, you could help the same people at a much lower cost, much more in their eyes, by just giving them cash. All right. Now, I understand why if you're doing it for kids, then you may be thinking, it's the parents that don't value their kids' health care, and I do, and I'm worried they're going to go and spend the money on alcohol rather than their kids' health. So again, I can see focusing on something on kids, but again, just saying we're going to go and give this to everybody because it's so important, that is, again, it's something that sounds good, but it is false. Right? It is not true that healthcare is worth every penny. There's a lot of healthcare that does little or nothing. There's a lot of healthcare that actually is worse than nothing. And there's a lot of evidence that people go to hospitals and get sicknesses they wouldn't have had otherwise because doctors are not washing their hands, and this kills a not small number of people. Right? It does not mean don't go to the doctor, but it does mean that when you say this is the most important thing for everyone to get, it's like there's a good chance that you are actually hurting them by giving them this, especially if their problem is minor to begin with. So again, I would say if you are going and giving people health care, then we're going to focus first of all on kids, refugees, people that can't help themselves. And then secondly, if we are going to give it to others, focus very much on how serious is their problem, how good is the evidence that the health treatment is actually useful for this. So again, if it's something like I've got back pain, well, medical profession has a very bad record of treating the back, right? So to say, he has horrible pain, he should be able to go to a doctor. Well, does it make sense to go and want to pay a lot for a doctor if the doctors themselves have a poor track record? So one of the main things that was said about Obamacare was there will be death panels, and that's just like there are in England. And that's terrible. And then people said, there are not death panels in England. It's just not true. And there wouldn't be death panels here. And my reaction is, actually, there are death panels in England, and it's good to have death panels because it means that you are sitting around thinking, well, how many lives can we save with this money? Right? If we're only going to be able to save one life for every $1 billion that we spend, this is a very poor use of money. There are easy ways to save a lot more lives with that money, and therefore it is not a good use of taxpayer money. Right? If someone said if it's worth one life, it saves one life, we should do it. That's crazy. That would be like saying, if we can save one life by shutting down all the swimming pools in America, we should do it. No, we should not shut down all the swimming pools to save one life because swimming pools are fun. Right? And an enormous number enjoy them and a very small number die, and that's terrible when that happens. And it'd be great if we paid more attention to figuring out ways, cost-effective ways to reduce the risk. But to say we're just going to go and shut down something that's very enjoyable for a lot of people because they're like in a country of 330 million people, a few people die swimming every year is just wrong and crazy.
It reminds me of the federal ban on lawn darts. After a couple of prominent, basically some children died, I think, in the 1980s due to steel-tipped lawn darts, and so now they're all plastic. Even though it was it was the situation you described, like it was a black swan event. Professor Caplan, we have just hit the hour mark. We have so many other things we wanted to ask you. So let me, can I give you one more real question and then one more kind of other question to end on?
Absolutely.
Okay.
Let's do it.
Right. I appreciate it. Okay. So the last policy question I want to ask you is about something called modern monetary theory, which we have heard a lot about. Stephanie Kelton just released her book called The Deficit Myth. And I mean, MMT, if it's legit, it sounds wonderful, right? I mean, taxes, you really don't need them except to fight inequality and control inflation. And otherwise, whatever program you might think is okay, you can pay for it without having to tax people into oblivion. So it sounds like a really cool idea. But I know you have described it as sort of nonsensical. I tried to find some more writing from you about it. I couldn't find too much, so I may just not have found it. But I wanted to ask you, given that this economic theory is sort of having its moment, what do you think of it?
Yeah. So, simple version is crazy. So, let me think about this. So, you take a look at a person and you say, look, there's this theory saying that if you stuff yourself with as much as you can eat every day, you will become morbidly obese and probably die at a young age. All right, it says, but look, I've been eating really heavily for a full week and I haven't died yet, so the theory's wrong. It's like, no, it's not wrong. You just just give it some time and it will end in the inevitable oblivion. All right, and that's where I see so-called modern monetary theory. Great branding. It's like, oh, it's modern. It's like, what's modern about it? This idea has been around for as long as there have been people who said if we just print enough money, everyone will be rich. So the idea that, well, we've been running big deficits for quite a while and we don't see total disaster and things, so we could run vastly bigger deficits forever, and it would continue to be like this. Very silly. So we can see that when countries actually do go and spend way beyond their means for a long time, while it is hard to predict exactly when the disaster will strike, the result is quite reliable. And again, what's striking, of course, is when a country does hit that wall, then the same people have been telling us the deficits don't matter, then start saying that a richer country should bail out the country that is failing and have more responsibility to help them out, which is what happened with Greece. All right, so again, as to when exactly we hit the wall, I don't know, and depends on a lot of factors. But just to say that we can spend freely without worrying about deficits indefinitely, and there's no sign that there's going to be any problem with it, is ridiculous. And furthermore, talk about a self-reversing prophecy. If there's someone that's very scrupulous, then maybe they don't need to worry about deficits because they hardly ever run them. Right? On the other hand, if there's someone that says, hey, there's nothing to worry about, I can spend as much as I want, that's the person that you should be expecting to be facing bankruptcy, and a very bad kind. So yeah.
Just to be clear, Greece didn't really have its own currency. The United States not only does, but is a fully sovereign nation that, if it so chose, could print the money, pay off its debt, and then, tomorrow, all those folks who are buying treasuries, they're just going to stop? Isn't the United States in a very, different position there than some of these countries that run into the issue you described? So
it is very different. So in particular, Greece, being on the euro, had a whole bunch of richer countries willing to bail them out. The U.S. does not have that. So it cuts both ways. It is true that if you have your own currency, then you can just print money to pay off the legal debt. But that is, in fact, barely better than simple repudiation in terms of what it does for your debt rating. And again, of course, there was nothing stopping Greece from repudiating. Greece could have just said, hey, we just don't have it, dude. We're not paying. However, the this is a case where even people who otherwise think that incentives don't matter have some dim awareness that if a country just repudiates its debt, that it's going to be really hard to borrow from then on, right? And so I mean, in terms, it is true that you can always pay off your nominal value of your debt if you have your own currency, but it does not mean that you can maintain your credit rating and the willingness of people around the world to lend to you. If you go and hyperinflate away your debt, it is effectively almost the same as repudiation in terms of what it does for your reputation. So, yeah. Again, of course, your strategy is, look, we're going to go and try to just run enormous deficits, get a ton of free stuff, and then repudiate. That's my plan. All right, so prove that it won't work. So I don't know, maybe it'll work because hardly anyone does it. But on the other hand, after that, your credit rating will be ruined. So you might remember, Murray Rothbard actually was a big fan of repudiation, just as a way of tying the hands of government to not spend much money again. So I do have a little bit of sympathy for that.
Here's
the thing is, like when third world countries want debt relief, they still don't want to repudiate because, again, like people won't want to lend to us again, and we want to be able to borrow. Instead, debt relief means some other countries pay our debts, which can work for a small poor country, isn't going to work for a big rich country.
Well, I gotta say, I haven't heard that about Rothbard, but it's interesting because it reminds me of like Grover Norquist's I want the government to be small enough for me to drown in a bathtub on steroids. I want the government to spend so much that it dissolves.
Yeah, to be begging on the streets for money.
Okay. After everything we've talked about tonight, I know we've got the coronavirus disaster going on right now, and even prior to that, there seems to have been in a lot of rich countries a renewed interest in socialism. How do you feel with respect to the world in the next 20 years? Do you think it's going to move toward more open markets, more open immigration, or are we entering the beginning of a long, dark period of more regulation, more state control?
Right. So my base prediction is always just that we'll muddle through and things will basically stay the same in terms of policy. So, I am not inclined to dramatic predictions. I think that like the things that have led to bad policy in the past will continue to lead to bad policy in the future. Unfortunately, things that have fostered good policy in the past will generally continue to lead to good policy in the future. Things generally change a lot less than people think. People are very inclined to overinterpret small changes as the beginning of a big trend. And then in terms of specific policies, so I think that actually we're going to be moving towards more open immigration, nothing close to open borders, but there just has been a big change in public opinion, and normally when there's a big change in opinion on any issue, it tends to move in that direction. So I think that once the Republicans are out of office, that in the U.S. at least, there will be at least a movement back to something like the immigration policies that we had before, and quite plausibly actually towards more open immigration because support has increased a lot. In terms of overall support for regulation, I think my view is that probably that's moving in a moderately bad direction. There is this move towards socialism, and again, especially young people seem to be sympathetic. As to what that means, of course, is unclear. Most people who announce themselves as socialists are too anti-intellectual to say what it really means. All right, so, and it pushed does it mean the Soviet Union? No, of course they don't mean the Soviet Union. It means Sweden. Never. All right, well, yeah, Sweden. But then, all right, well, what are things really like in Sweden? They have school choice in Sweden. It's like, well, no, I don't want that. So, as to what it really means is unclear. Out of people that are actually pushing socialism as an idea, I think the real, when people say, oh, they don't mean the Soviet Union, they mean Sweden, I think the real thing they mean is, I don't want to tell you what I mean. Ha ha. So like, oh, when I say socialism, does that make you think of the Soviet Union? Oh, well, I don't know. Maybe I'm not going to say that was a bad idea. I'm not going to say it was a good idea. I'm just using the word, and like maybe it does, maybe it doesn't. Maybe it means Sweden. So what I've called in my blog is socialism is a provocative equivocation. It's where you use a word deliberate, knowing full well that you're going to scare the bejesus out of some people, including, I should mention, some people who have suffered horribly under socialist regimes.
Yeah.
So my wife escaped from communist Romania, right? So when you tell someone like that you favor socialism, you may think it's a big joke, but it's not a joke to them because they remember what that word meant, and maybe you mean that word, maybe you don't mean what they experienced, but when you say it, so unapologetically without any willingness to consider that they might reasonably be feeling afraid for their freedom. And again, I think that this is a very bad thing to do, right? And again, like there is this long history in socialism of just saying, well, like when there's an experiment going on, saying that's socialism. And again, they could be doing a wide range of things, but as long as it's sufficiently just just defying normal Western economic policy, that's socialism. And then, of course, when it seems like it's starting to do badly, that's when you start getting complaining about how people are bad-mouthing it and being unfair. And then when it finally collapses, that's where it's time to say that was never socialism in the first place. Yeah, so there's a great book by Christian Niemitz at the IEA called "Socialism: The Failed Idea That Never Dies," and again, this book is just a wonder of intellectual history because it does show that this is a pattern, right? So it's not that just recently that people started saying that's not real socialism. Rather, there's a pattern of being excited when it seems to people like it might work, and the question, is it really socialism, only starts to get debated once it seems to be a terrible dystopian regime. And again, once you realize that that is the game people are playing, it really is a reason to be very nervous about anyone calling themselves a socialist. It's kind of thing where it just shows at best a cavalier and flippant attitude towards policies that might or might not mean the deaths of millions of people through starvation. So if someone thinks that's a big joke, then I don't think they should be an intellectual. That's not a joke. So again, I don't think that anything like Soviet policies or Venezuelan policies is going to be coming to first world countries during my lifetime. Of course, it wouldn't shock me if it happened to one or two. But in terms of just moving towards higher levels of regulation, that seems likely. And especially, I think that it's likely that when moving to higher levels of taxation, again, just because modern monetary theory is wrong, and countries don't want to repudiate, they don't want to hyperinflate, and they don't want to cut back on spending, and they love universal programs. So put that all together, and it seems very likely that the main adjustment is just going to be to have higher taxation overall, and again, especially higher taxes on the rich, so more progressive taxes. This is what has popular support. Even rich people generally seem to be more favorable towards higher taxes on the rich than higher taxes on the poor. So I think that higher taxes in the medium run are likely. As to how high the taxes are likely to get, it basically just depends upon how long we wait. If we wait long enough, then those taxes are going to be really high. And also, like that point, it might really be desperate enough that we start doing spending cuts and inflating it away, or even repudiation. But again, if it happens more, at a sooner point, then again, probably just higher taxes. So that's what I think is the most likely forecast. It varies a bit by countries. Like Canada's done a lot better on its deficit than the U.S., so they don't need to change very much. The U.S., something's got to change. Yeah. Right. As to how long you can delay it, my sons always like to tell me, Japan's budget, total debt's like 300% of GDP. They're doing it, Dad. Right. So maybe we can too. It's like, all right, maybe we can. But on the other hand, there's a reason you're talking about Japan, which is it's the biggest outlier among rich countries. Probably most countries can't get away with that. People trust international lenders trust Japan more than they trust us, and reasonably so, probably.
Wow. Well, on that note, Professor Caplan, I think our last question is real simple. Which is worse, hating multinational corporations or hating your parents?
Yeah, that's a really good question. Let's see. Yeah, I think I'm going to go with hating multinational corporations. So, as a parent, I will say that it's a tough call. But on the other hand, there are actually a lot of bad parents out there. Yeah. Again, for multinational corporations, I think the share of them that are just really awful and cruel and evil is quite low. The main thing that I'll say about multinational corporations is, they're cowardly and opportunistic. But at the same time, multinational corporations very reliably deliver the goods. Right, they are the main ones that not only produce the goods that keep mankind alive, but they also are on the cutting edge of not just technological progress, but managerial progress, figuring out better ways of organizing people in order to get more output out of the out of humanity. So as a fact about multinational corporations, they can go to poor countries and they can train the locals to operate at near a first world level of productivity. Right, so it's a quite incredible thing that multinationals do, and yet they get so much anger heaped on them. So again, I think I would say that a lot of the reason why I give this answer is just that parents have so there's so much social pressure to love parents. So I think that the actual level of hate they're getting is modest, and the parents that get hated, though often not deserving, often are. Whereas multinational corporations tend to get a lot of hate regardless of what they do, and what they're typically doing is quite great. So that's what I'd say. What most parents are typically doing is quite great. They are handing out the gift of life uncompensated. So worth keeping in mind. So, but yeah, but like also quite good. It's a tough question. Like it is a tough question, and that's one you could probably at least make me second guess my answer pretty easily. But again, think about this: like the marginal hatred of corporations is worse. Like when one more person tips over, because it is just piling on, like on very productive organizations that do so much, ask for get so little respect, and where there's so many policies that are geared at really just persecuting them for no good reason. For parents, on the other hand, they start off with a pretty high level of respect and affection, so a little bit more doubt about them. When the marginal doubt about parents probably isn't so bad.
Well, hey, as a corporate lawyer, I had to ask that one when I saw it in your blog. Because
Nice.
That one I just thought that's my kind of question. All right. So Professor Caplan, thank you so much for giving us your time. I know there's so much more to talk about. I really hope we can talk again sometime.
Yeah, that sounds great. This is a lot of fun.
Right on. So glad to hear that. Professor Caplan, we'll look forward to talking to you soon. Good luck finishing up the new book on poverty, and thank you so much for your time tonight.
My pleasure. Thanks a lot.
All right. Take care.